Forced to fight. Pelican Bay's Deadliest Prison Secret. True crime documentary. The yelling started before anyone understood what was happening. Two men were slammed into the small concrete yard at Pelican Bay State Prison, the doors locking behind them. Both were shaking with anger, fear, and hunger. They knew what this was. Everyone in the security housing unit knew. The guards were ordering another gladiator fight, a secret battle where inmates were forced to fight each other while officers stood and watched. One guard shouted for them to move, and when they didn't, he shot a warning round that cracked against the wall, making dust fall like sand. The inmates had no choice. They charged at each other, fists swinging, bodies slamming. The other guards laughed as if it were a show. But this time, something went horribly wrong. One man slipped, hit his head on the ground, and did not get back up. His body twitched. Blood ran across the yard floor in a thin line. The surviving inmate froze, raising his hands, begging the guards to help. Instead, they kept watching, waiting to see if he would finish the job. He refused. And that refusal changed everything. What happened next spread through the prison like wildfire. Before anyone could move, another round was fired, louder this time. The surviving inmate dropped to his knees. Guards rushed in, shouting orders, dragging the injured man away. The yard smelled like iron and dust. The surviving inmate knew he might be next. As he knelt there, breathing hard, the guards whispered among themselves. Then one of them said something that chilled him to the bone. Next round happens tomorrow. The scene ended there, leaving everyone in the block whispering in fear. The fights weren't a rumor anymore, they were real, and now someone had died. But how did something this brutal even start inside one of the most secure prisons in America? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, to the early 1990s when Pelican Bay State Prison first opened. It was built to house some of the most dangerous inmates in the country, including top members of rival gangs. The security housing unit, known as the SHU, was designed to keep these men locked down for almost 24 hours a day. No sunlight, no real human contact, no fresh air except for an hour in a small concrete box that barely felt like outside. Tension grew fast. Every group inside wanted control, and officers felt pressure to keep the violence from exploding. That was when some guards came up with an idea so shocking, most people wouldn't believe it unless they saw it. They decided to put members of rival gangs in the yard together so they would fight. They told supervisors it was a mistake or a miscommunication, but inmates knew better. They heard guards laughing, they heard bets being made on who would win, and the fights kept happening.
Some inmates tried to refuse to enter the yard. Those who refused were punished. They were denied showers. Their food trays came cold, stale, or sometimes half empty. Some men were given what they called the loaf, a hard block of food mashed together that tasted like wet cardboard. Others said their trays smelled like they were taken from the trash. Hunger made them weak, and weakness made them easier to control. By the time the first serious injury happened, inmates had been whispering for months that these fights weren't accidents. They believed guards wanted blood, and now that a man had died, they knew something bigger was coming, something far worse, something that would pull the entire prison into chaos. Because the next day, the guards had already picked the next two men for the yard, and both of them were ready to kill or be killed. The yard was quiet at dawn, but the tension was thicker than ever. Everyone in the security housing unit knew what was coming. Two men had already been chosen for the next fight. One of them, barely 25, had survived a previous encounter, but was still haunted by the memory of blood on the concrete. The other was new to the SHU, a man who had spent years in other prisons, but never seen anything like Pelican Bay. They were both hungry, weak, and angry. Guards watched from above, their eyes cold and unmoving, like spectators at a cruel game. When the doors opened, The two men were shoved into the yard. The concrete under their feet was gray and slick from the early morning mist. No sunlight touched them. The only sound was the low murmur of the other inmates, hundreds of eyes fixed on the two men. The fight started almost immediately. Fists flew, elbows connected, and bodies slammed against the walls. But unlike the first fight, these men had no previous knowledge of each other's strengths or weaknesses. Every punch could end the fight in a second. The new inmate took a hard hit to the ribs and stumbled. Pain shot through him, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. But then he remembered the half-rotten loaf they had given him for breakfast. The dry, tasteless block of food that barely filled his stomach had left him lightheaded and weak. The hunger gnawed at him, making every movement harder, making his mind focus only on survival. The other inmate, slightly stronger but also starving, pressed the attack. A guard laughed and whistled from above. "Come on, fight!" he shouted. No one came to stop them. No one even tried to break it up. The rules were simple: either fight or suffer more punishment later. Refuse, and your meals will be taken away. Refuse, and you will be sent back to your cell for 23 hours alone. The new inmate found a burst of strength. He dodged a punch, grabbed his opponent, and slammed him against the wall. A sickening crack echoed through the yard. The other man gasped for air, blood trickling from his nose. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Guards circled, making sure the men didn't stop. They wanted more. The spectators, other inmates in their cells, watched in silence. Some prayed, some whispered encouragement, some cheered quietly, afraid the guards would notice if they were too loud. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat mixed with blood, turning the air heavy and metallic. The weaker man fell to the ground but tried to crawl away. The stronger one advanced, but then he froze. He had seen something that made him stop in his tracks. A guard signaling with a hand gesture he had never seen before. It was a warning. The next punch could be deadly. And if he didn't fight, he knew the punishment for refusal would be worse than anything in the yard. Suddenly, a noise erupted from the guard tower. Another officer had dropped a heavy tray of food, causing it to crash on the concrete. The sound distracted both men for a moment, and that split second changed everything. The weaker inmate used it to roll over and strike the other man in the jaw. The stronger one staggered back, dazed. Then, the worst thing happened. The weaker man slipped, his foot landing on something sticky and cold. He looked down and saw a mixture of old food and blood. It coated the ground like glue. He stumbled, fell, and landed on his side. Pain shot through him, and he realized he couldn't get up. The stronger inmate approached slowly, unsure if he should strike. From the shadows of the guard tower, a single warning shot rang out. Silence followed. The yard smelled of fear and iron. Everyone froze. And somewhere in the block, another fight was already being whispered about, one that would make this one seem minor in comparison. The yard was silent except for the faint groans of the injured man lying on the concrete. Guards stood above, arms crossed, eyes scanning the perimeter as if nothing had happened. But the tension was unbearable. Every inmate in the security housing unit knew the next fight could be worse. Some whispered about retaliation, others about escape, though everyone knew escape was impossible. Pelican Bay's walls were designed to trap the mind as much as the body. The stronger inmate, still breathing heavily, looked around. His opponent was barely moving. He could end it here, end the fight once and for all. But something inside him hesitated. He remembered the first man who had died in the previous fight. He remembered the cold, tasteless loaves of food, the hunger, and the endless punishment that followed refusal. A surge of fear and clarity hit him. This wasn't a game. This was survival. And surviving meant more than winning a fight.
Suddenly, the loud clang of the metal gate echoed through the yard. Another group of inmates had been brought out, younger, faster, more desperate. The guards were signaling for the next round. One of the new men stumbled, seeing the mess on the ground from the previous fight, the blood, the sweat, the remnants of food that had been thrown as punishment. Their eyes widened with fear. They knew what awaited them. The surviving inmate backed away, dragging himself toward the small wall that separated the yard from the cells. Guards shouted at him, but he refused to move further into the yard. He had learned something important. Cooperation with the cruelty would only bring more pain. Hunger and fear could be weapons, but they could also be shields. He had survived this long by using his mind, not just his fists. The guards grew frustrated. One banged a baton against the railing. Another yelled that he would be locked down for the rest of the week if he didn't comply. But the inmate didn't flinch. Across the yard, the new inmates were forced forward, trembling, eyes darting, fists clenching. The atmosphere was electric with terror. Then, it happened. A sudden fight broke out between two of the new inmates before they even reached the center. One pushed the other retaliated. Blood and bruises were immediate. Guards stepped back, watching as chaos consumed the yard. The surviving inmate watched from the wall, knowing this was the result of months of manipulation, starvation, and cruel control. This was what Pelican Bay had become, a place where hunger, fear, and violence fed on each other until no one could remember who started it. Hours later, after the chaos settled, the yard was empty again. The injured men were dragged back to their cells. Silence returned, but it was not peace. Inmates whispered about the fights, about the guards who forced them, about the loaves of punishment food, about how hunger had been turned into a weapon. Some plotted revenge. Others prayed they would survive another day. The surviving inmate, now back in his cell, sat alone on the cold floor. He touched his bruises and thought about the men who hadn't made it out alive. He thought about the guards who treated human lives like entertainment. He thought about tomorrow, when another round would begin, when more blood would spill, and he realized something terrifying. The real fight was not just in the yard. The real fight was inside Pelican Bay itself, in every cell, every corridor, every corner, where survival meant more than strength.
Outside the cell, the faint sound of a metal tray being dropped echoed. It was a reminder that hunger, fear, and control were always present. And as night fell over the maximum security walls, the SHU remained a place where the gladiators of Pelican Bay fought, bled, and sometimes died, while the world outside never knew their names. Night fell over Pelican Bay, but sleep never came. The surviving inmate lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant echoes inside the SHU. Every sound was sharp. Metal doors slamming, guards' boots striking the floor, and the muffled whispers of men who hadn't spoken to another human in days. The darkness felt heavy, like it had a weight of its own. Suddenly, the silence broke. A loud alarm rang across the block, sharp enough to make every inmate sit up instantly. Something was happening. Something big. Guards rushed past the cells, their radios crackling with static and short, panicked voices. The surviving inmate pressed his face near the slot in his door, trying to see, but the hallway was chaos. Flashing blue lights illuminated the concrete walls in sharp bursts. A guard shouted down the hall, "Lockdown! Everyone stays in place!" But the inmates already knew lockdown meant trouble. Someone had snapped. Someone had reached the limit of fear, hunger, and cruelty. Word spread fast, whispered from cell to cell. An inmate from another tier had refused to enter the yard and was dragged out by force. He fought back, and the guards responded with even more force. The surviving inmate felt a cold shiver. He knew the man they were talking about. He was young, strong, and always hungry because his food trays came missing portions for weeks. Now he had been pushed too far. Moments later, the distant sound of a struggle echoed through the vents. Metal hitting metal, a grunt, a crash, then silence. The kind of silence that meant something terrible had happened. Guards spoke in rushed whispers, but one sentence carried through the hallway like smoke. he didn't make it. The surviving inmate closed his eyes. Another life lost, another secret the world would never hear. Pelican Bay didn't document everything. Some things were left to rot inside the walls.
The next morning, the entire SHU was colder than usual. Breakfast trays were delivered late. The surviving inmate received another punishment loaf, dry, hard, and flavorless. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, and for the first time felt anger burn hotter than fear. This wasn't food, this was control. This was a reminder that he had no power, no safety, and no way out. Later that day, guards lined up inmates for medical checks, though everyone knew it was just another way to evaluate who could fight next. The surviving inmate stepped into the hallway, hands cuffed, head down. As he walked, he saw the faces of other inmates, bruised, hollow, hungry. Some looked defeated, others looked ready to explode. A guard leaned close to him and whispered, "Hope you're ready for the next yard session." The guard smirked, tapping his baton against his palm. The surviving inmate didn't answer. He simply looked forward, jaw tight. For the first time, something had changed inside him. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to remember. Every guard who laughed, every tray of rotten food, every fight forced, every man who fell and never got back up. That night, as he sat on his bunk, listening to the quiet hum of the prison, he whispered to himself, "Someone has to tell the truth." It wasn't a plan, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise to himself, a promise that the world outside would one day learn what really happened inside Pelican Bay. The forced fights, the starvation, the secrets hidden behind concrete walls. But the guards had their own plans, and before sunrise, the surviving inmate would discover that the deadliest gladiator fight wasn't in the yard. It was the one being prepared for him next. The surviving inmate woke before sunrise, even though he had barely slept. A heavy feeling sat in his stomach, not hunger, something worse. Something he felt in his bones. The air in the SHU was too quiet. Even the guards walked differently, their steps slow and deliberate. He knew what that meant. Something was planned, and it involved him. A loud clang echoed through the tier, followed by the footsteps of multiple guards. They were moving with purpose. Doors opened, one after another. Men were taken out, chained, and marched away. The surviving inmate sat up, his heart beating fast. He heard whispers from nearby cells.
They're setting up the yard again. They said today's fight is different. They're choosing him. Within seconds, his door slid open. Cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. A guard grabbed his shoulder and pushed him forward. The hallway felt darker than usual. The flickering overhead lights cast long shadows on the walls. The surviving inmate kept his eyes ahead, refusing to show fear. But inside, he felt something breaking. As they reached the outside gate, he saw something he had never seen before. Nearly a dozen guards waiting, watching him closely. Some looked excited, others looked tense. And then he noticed the yard. It wasn't empty. 3 inmates were already inside, standing far apart, their bodies bruised and exhausted. These weren't random inmates. These were men known for violence, men who rarely backed down. It wasn't a fight they were setting up. It was an execution. The guards shoved him forward. The concrete beneath his feet felt colder than ever. The sun was barely rising, its pale light mixing with the blue-toned shadows of the yard. The surviving inmate took a deep breath. He could feel the eyes of the others on him. They weren't angry. They were afraid because they knew the truth. 4 men in the yard. Only one would walk out. One guard shouted, "Spread out!" The inmates obeyed. The surviving inmate backed toward the far wall, trying to think, trying to predict what might happen. He knew the guards wanted them to fight, but something about today felt wrong. Too many guards were watching. Too many silent radios. Too many stares. Then a door opened on the upper level.
a higher-ranking officer stepped out. He wasn't usually on the yard. His presence meant something serious was happening. He leaned over the rail, his voice echoing down. "Begin." The three inmates turned their heads toward the surviving inmate, not out of hate, but because they had no choice. Hunger, punishment, and fear had pushed them into survival mode. They looked desperate. Their ribs were visible through their shirts. Their eyes were tired. One of them whispered, "Sorry, brother." And then the first punch was thrown. The surviving inmate dodged quickly, but the second attacker came from behind. The impact knocked him to the ground. Dust rose around him. He scrambled to his feet, breathing hard. All three men circled him. They didn't want to kill him, but they also didn't want to die.
Every move was slow, heavy, and painful. The men were too weak to fight for long. Hunger made their legs shake. The punishment loaves had drained them of strength. Sweat mixed with dried blood on the ground. It felt like the yard itself was watching them. Suddenly, one inmate collapsed, not from a punch, from exhaustion. He hit the concrete hard. The guards didn't move to help. They didn't even blink. The surviving inmate backed away, gasping. He looked around, searching for anything, a mistake, a distraction, a way out. But there was nothing, only tall concrete walls and watchful guards. And then he made eye contact with the officer above. The man didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply raised his hand with a subtle gesture, the same gesture that had signaled death before. The surviving inmate understood. This fight wasn't going to end in the yard. It was going to end with him. In the end, this story is more than a tale of brutality behind concrete walls. It is a reminder of how far institutions can go when no one is watching. In a place where freedom is already gone, even a basic human need like food becomes a weapon, a tool of control, and a silent method of breaking the spirit. But stories like this matter because they expose the truth about what happens in the darkest corners of America's prison system. They remind us that justice doesn't end at sentencing. It continues in how prisoners are treated, the conditions they live in, and the basic rights they are still entitled to. If we look away, this cycle continues. If we pay attention, it can finally begin to change. Thank you for watching this documentary. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into real American true crime history. Which shocking true crime case should we uncover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Your idea could be our next documentary.